Tonight on Talking Politics, the Orange Line is back on track, at least for now, but the T's problems didn't start or end with the shutdown. Still, despite the system's many struggles on his watch, Governor Charlie Baker doesn't seem to have paid any political price, which is par for the course when it comes to the governor. We'll dig into Baker's seeming untouchability and the political Teflon that also appears to cover the state legislature. First, though, a review of the big political developments this week, including Baker's attempt to strike a tricky balance on immigration in the wake of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis flying migrants to Martha's Vineyard. But let's start with the race to replace Baker. With Election Day around the corner, polls have Maura Healey with a very comfortable lead approaching or exceeding 20 percentage points. But when the votes are counted, her opponent Geoff Diehl has been hedging on whether he'll accept the results. In a story out Sunday about Republicans who might pull a Trump and challenge the outcome in November, Diehl's spokesperson told a New York Times reporter no comment when asked if he will accept the results. Later, the campaign sent a statement to me and other reporters suggesting that no comment was being misconstrued, but not really backing away from the idea of an election challenge either. Joining me to discuss are Steph Solis, the co-author of Axios Boston's morning newsletter, and GBH News politics editor Peter Kadzis. Good to see you both. One of you in studio, one of you from our Jamaica Plain satellite studio. Steph, Geoff Diehl, as I just mentioned, basically is arguing that this is a non-story. I'm going to paraphrase the statement that I got from him. It was essentially saying, you know, the election hasn't even happened yet. It would be foolish to commit to accepting the results before the election occurs. If there's irregularities that call the outcome into doubt, I will mount a legal challenge. If there aren't irregularities, of course, I'll accept the result. This is the liberal media asking gotcha questions to create a false narrative. Those last phrases were all used by candidate Diehl. Do you agree that this is a non-story, or do you think that that bit of waffling to the New York Times is significant?
Any high-ranking state official or candidate seeking state office is going to be more closely scrutinized whether they give a comment or decline to comment. And so I think it was worth asking, considering his reaction to the 2020 presidential election results, and a no comment is certainly going to raise eyebrows. Now, his response to you seemed a lot more nuanced and measured. And I think it would have been a non-story if he had given that answer to the New York Times to begin with.
Yeah, that's a good point. I actually tend to agree with you. Peter Kadzis, do you think it's a non-story, or do you think there's something worth watching here?
Well, I agree largely with Steph. Listen, he was sticking it to the New York Times. To what end, how useful that was, I don't know. But I don't see anything to get a dander up about yet. Let's see how the election goes. Massachusetts has a pretty darn good electoral system. It's been a long time. I can't really remember the last time there were any irregularities, short of Boston not having enough foreign-speaking poll workers, which was years ago. So I think actually Diehl has played this to his benefit. He got to stick it to the Times, which his supporters would love, and then he got to clarify it to you. So I'm not going to lose any sleep over it.
All right. And it is, I'm glad that you mentioned, Steph, his stance on the 2020 election. We should remind people that he'd initially said, no, it wasn't stolen from Donald Trump. He, I believe, told Jim Browdy when Jim was sitting right here that Republicans needed to move on and stop crying over spilled milk. Now he says the exact opposite. It was definitely stolen from Trump, rigged election, all the usual things that you hear from people who are echoing the former president. Peter Kadzis, I want to ask you about Baker and immigration and the balance that he is looking to strike on this issue. He made a comment going back to last weekend when he was asked by a reporter at a press conference if he had spoken with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. And what Governor Baker said was, Any conversation with any governor doesn't really get me anywhere. Then he continued, sending people all over the country, many of whom have no idea why they're being sent where they're going, isn't a solution to the very screwed up immigration system that we have in the U.S. Washington needs to do its job. When I first saw those comments from the governor, I guess I just had my cynical or skeptical hat on, and I thought, what are you talking about? Talking to any governor doesn't do you much good. There's one governor who just sent 2 plane loads of migrants to Martha's Vineyard. But then when I revisited it, I was struck at what seemed like some subtle pushback at DeSantis, saying effectively doing this doesn't solve the problem at all. What was your read on the governor's comments there, but also just the tone he's struck in the week since this story first hit?
Well, in many ways, it's classic Charlie Baker. This is a problem that's not of his making, and he wishes it would just disappear. By the way, I'm reading his mind.
Same.
Although I conducted a little field research. I asked a classic Baker Democrat, otherwise known as my wife, what she thought of this reaction. And she said she thought it was time for the governor to man up.
Oh.
She said he's got nothing to lose. He's not up for re-election. He should just man up and call out to Santos.
Oh, that's interesting. And I got to say, I don't know that we'll get any. I'd love to see polling data on how Baker supporters feel about his handling of this. Although, as we'll talk about later in the show, they'll probably approve it by about 70% to 30%. Steph, does the governor's measured approach on this issue suggest to you that he wants some kind of a role nationally shaping the course of the GOP after he leaves office as governor, or am I jumping the gun there?
I don't think we can predict what he'll be doing. I would not be surprised, though, even if it's not immediately. I do recall him joking, or maybe half joking, that his wife wants him to get some hobbies. But down the line, I could definitely see him trying to revive moderate republicanism on the national stage. I don't know that immigration will be the first topic with which he does that, because he frankly seems to be uncomfortable with it, understandably trying to ensure a smooth, compassionate humanitarian response, but also not necessarily going to the lengths of his Democratic colleagues on Beacon Hill to sue DeSantis or call for an investigation or speak out on the situation there.
You mentioned the calls to sue DeSantis, and that wasn't something I was going to bring up, but I should. Can you just tell people who might have missed it what's happening right now in terms of calls coming from here in Massachusetts for some sort of federal investigation of what he did? Yes.
So there are attorneys who have sued DeSantis and who are also calling on the state attorney general and on U.S. Attorney Rachel Rollins to launch investigations, specifically alleging that the rights of the migrants who arrived here have been violated, whether it's a civil rights violation or something else. It's yet to be seen, but that's what they're alleging. State Rep. Dylan Fernandez and State Senator Julian Cyr have also called for criminal investigations, and they sent a letter to the Department of Justice earlier this week making that call. And you know, among other things, if that were to happen, if we'd see a federal probe initiated, that would up the pressure on the governor to maybe say things that he has not said or talk about it more in the future. Peter, I want to get your take on Governor Baker's political future and whether this very Bakerish response to this particular situation might also suggest that he wants a national role in the Republican Party moving forward. What do you think?
Well, I wouldn't read too much into what Baker said. There is an important through line, though. For 8 years, Charlie Baker has been critical of Congress for dodging the issue of immigration. If I had been advising the governor, I would have advised him to hit the congressional side much harder, because that's where the roadblock is. By the way, the odds of something happening in the near future are remote, but that still doesn't mean Congress shouldn't be hit. The Republican Party, as it's now constituted, I'm not sure would have a place for Charlie Baker.
Yeah.
Although, as Steph suggests, that doesn't mean he might not try from the margins to bring back a sense of moderation.
Steph, I want to shift gears and talk about the climate protests that occurred in Boston this week. Protesters trying to draw attention to the problem of climate change, shut down the roads in the city at a few different locations. And I want to play some video of one of the protesters explaining why they took the approach that they did. Let's take a look.
It's an alarm. And what are our alarms like? They're loud, they wake you up, and they say this is an emergency.
I'm curious, as someone who watches politics, what your take is on the efficacy of the approach used by the protesters. Do you think this is a way to either change hearts and minds or get people to take climate change and its consequences and our role in it more seriously, or not?
I think well, I can't say whether it would be effective in the long term or the short term for that matter. I mean, you have Beacon Hill leaders who don't move fast even when they agree on something.
There's
and
that, yeah.
Business leaders tend to sort of get unhappy when they see this sort of disruption, but there is something to be said for the efficacy of planting a seed and getting some people to talk about it, and even having support for the cause from leaders like Mayor Michelle Wu. And so this isn't an issue that's going to go away, but whether it will be effective or not, it's too early to tell.
You know, I remember talking with a protest organizer back when protesters who were working on the same issue barricaded the front of Governor Baker's house. If I recall correctly, one or more of them chained themselves to a boat in front of the governor's house, if my memory serves. And I was asking about tactics then, and what she said to me has stuck with me. It was basically, we try other ways of getting people to pay attention to this topic, and no one covers it. No one covers our calls to take this seriously. So when we do this, look, the media shows up. And she did have a point. Peter Kadzis, I want to ask you about Mayor Michelle Wu's response. Steph alluded to this earlier. I believe that Michelle Wu may have protested with this group back before she became mayor. But here's how she responded to their efforts in Boston. Again, brief bit of video, take a look.
I know and I share deeply the frustration and urgency that folks face. We are working every day to do our part on the side of city government.
Peter Kadzis, is there any sort of political risk for Mayor Wu in striking that empathetic a note involving a protest that a lot of people probably saw as a big pain in the butt?
Mayor Wu was playing to her base, classic political move. The protest to disrupt traffic was largely ineffectual. If that had been a very effective protest, and say had shut down the morning commute, I'm not sure she would have been as supportive.
Before we go, Peter, I'm curious about your take on the efficacy of this sort of thing. We heard Steph, I think, hedge a bit, as I probably would too. I think I did. Do you think that this is a good way to get people to take climate change seriously?
No, not really. Polls show that there's widespread awareness of it. I share, I think, everyone's frustration at the slow pace at which we're addressing this. But I don't think it helps. I don't think it hurts. You know, to me, it's a form of virtue signaling and makes the people who are protesting, feel morally superior.
All right. On that note, Peter Kadzis, Steph Solis, thank you both. To the surprise of many, the T's 30-day Orange Line shutdown ended on time, and the line has been back up and running all week. It's no small feat, and Governor Baker has been quietly celebrating since construction wrapped up.
With the closure over the last 30 days, the T's been able to complete 5 years of improvements to track and signal infrastructure while also addressing safety actions on a much faster timeline.
Of course, the T's extreme makeover came after a host of embarrassing and sometimes frightening problems brought the system to the brink of a federal takeover. But you would never know it from Baker's consistently high popularity ratings, which have weathered other big crises too, like the deadly COVID outbreak at the Holyoke Soldiers' Home. It's a phenomenon Boston Globe associate editor and columnist Joan Vennochi has chronicled in depth. She joins me now along with Bay State Banner senior editor Yawu Miller to talk about Baker's seeming immunity from political consequences and a similar dynamic that's developing with the Massachusetts Legislature. Joan, as someone who has been thinking about Baker's untouchability for a while, have you formed a grand unifying theory of why he apparently pays no consequences when things go wrong?
Well, it's the legacy of his administration. And I have to say, I was on the Orange Line yesterday, and it's running very, very slowly, and there's 20 minutes wait for the next train to come. So I'm not sure he should be taking that big of a victory lap right now. I don't really know why he's still as popular as he is. I mean, I think he, as I wrote, he always exudes an illusion of competence. He's cool, he's calm, he's collected, he's drama-free, he's tall. All of those things. And I also think that it's interesting that people seem to expect less from government when a Republican is in charge in Massachusetts. I think you think back to the past and think to Deval Patrick when he was governor. He took a lot of flack for things that went wrong on his watch, and there seems to be a different standard these days.
You mentioned Baker's height, and I want to ask, do you really think that that plays a role as people figure out or subconsciously form opinions about the governor? Does the fact that he's a big guy, I mean, he's a few inches taller than me, you really think that makes a difference?
It sounds superficial to say, but I think there is some truth. In American politics, tall people win, and there's just something about just he uses his height, I think. I'm not saying, I mean, he's got it, like, why not use it? Mm-hmm. It's not an intimidating factor, but it adds to the air of somebody who's above it all, and he escapes a lot of blame that way.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you've thought about this as much as Joan has because you haven't been writing about it, but you do watch politics closely. Why do you think Baker hasn't paid a price when it comes to voter popularity or approval for the various things that have gone wrong over the past 8 years?
It makes no sense. And so the tall theory is maybe one of the few things that does make sense, but yeah, I mean, you look at the way Deval Patrick was treated in the pages of the Herald or have you, and he was blamed for everything that went wrong. Absolutely, Baker is the most popular governor in the country. In Massachusetts, a state where voters, voters are in favor of immigrants having driver's licenses. He's against that. Voters are in favor of the millionaire's tax. He's against that. It just defies logic, right? Like you, as somebody who reads the news all the time, you're wondering, are the voters, the people who are answering these opinion polls about Baker, reading the same things that I'm reading? It might as well just be because he's tall.
Let me ask you both. I have a theory, and I'll try to articulate it about maybe why he has been as resilient as he has been. Obviously, he was governor during the Trump presidency, at least the first administration of the former president. We'll see what the future holds. And Baker's style was so radically different than Trump's. He was a Republican, reminding people that Republicans could take a very different approach to government. Doing that here in Massachusetts, where I think we all, transplants and natives alike, like to think of politics as being better. Did he get sort of a Trump, I guess discount isn't the right term, but is it possible that he was boosted over the past few years simply because he overlapped with the former president and showed people it doesn't need to be that way?
Well, he does come across as the voice of reason, and he does sort of talk a lot about his bipartisan approach to government. Yeah. And I think that does resonate with people. If you think about how he handled the big controversy over the 50 migrants who landed in Martha's Vineyard, he declined to say anything about Governor DeSantis from Florida. He's not engaged on that level at all. He hasn't talked about the politics of it, but he did make sure that the migrants were taken care of in the right way. And I think people appreciate that, and I think he deserves credit for that. I like to see a little bit more passion from my politicians. I'd like to know what he really thinks about DeSantis.
Yeah, same.
You'll never know from Baker. But I think to a lot of people that doesn't matter. They just like the fact that he took charge and he made it happen, and that's to his credit.
Yeah, well, am I barking up the wrong tree with the idea of a Trump bump for the baker?
Yeah, and I also think
ratings?
I think that there's that could very well be part of it. There's also, his affect. When he ran against Deval Patrick, and Patrick was an incumbent, he was like the angry, white guy. Yeah,
right? I remember the had enough ads.
Yeah. And he changed his affect when he ran the next time, and his voice became more flat. And he explained things to people in a very flat tone. Mm-hmm. He also has a good deal of charisma on the campaign trail. When I saw him in the Dorchester Day Parade, he kind of zigzagged across the street, like shook everybody's hand, very personable. I've seen him talk to people. He talked to a guy who he'd played basketball against in high school. Recognized the guy, they had a really good rapport. I mean, he has like a lot of charisma. But still, I mean, again.
I am glad that you mentioned the charisma piece, because those of us in the media, if we see him at a press conference, he can be a little bit Belichickian in terms of his affect. He's not necessarily thrilled to be taking questions from the press. But I was at the Big E in Springfield yesterday, West Springfield, and the governor was going through the Massachusetts building, meeting all these vendors who were selling, cool foodstuffs from across the state. People were thrilled to see him, and he was a different guy than you see when you're at a press conference. A lot of the selfies where he was using his height to his advantage and smiling broadly, and people were smiling broadly with him. So that's a factor too. I want to ask both of you about the legislature, because in a sense it's apples to oranges. The governor's elected statewide. Members of the legislature are not, of course. But I've been fascinated, kind of obsessed actually, at the way that the legislature's end of session this cycle didn't become more of a story. You had them, as they usually do, put off pretty much everything until the last minute. Not everything, but almost everything. You had a bunch of important things not get done as a result. And then you had Ron Mariano, the House Speaker, when asked if the legislature might, extend its session, say, and I think this is almost a verbatim quote, people have vacations planned. So, and now I can think of no other line of work in which if you put off the stuff that you're supposed to do, don't get it done, and then say, well, I got to go on vacation. I just don't think that would fly in most places. And yet, people in Massachusetts don't look to take out incumbent legislators by running against them. We have a graphic. I want to roll it really quickly just to show how bad we are. In 2020, according to Ballotpedia, 75% of Massachusetts legislative races were uncontested. 61% in Wyoming, 58% in Rhode Island, but we were the worst in the country. You compare that to California, just 4% of races uncontested, 3% in New Hampshire, 2% in Michigan and Minnesota. Yeah, well, let me start with you. When the legislature expresses its disinterest in how voters feel, disinterest in getting its job done, year after year after year, why don't people who are incumbent legislators get challenges?
I think there's a the legislature itself, the House Speaker, one of his core functions is to protect his members against challenges, to keep them intact, and it's oftentimes, or more often than not, against Republicans. So legislators' votes in committees are not public. We don't know how they voted in committees. They do a lot of secret meetings, if you will, where they're not subject to the same open meeting laws that every other form of government in Massachusetts is, and they're notoriously opaque. They're routinely. I don't have the statistic on it, but routinely they get low marks for transparency. Yeah. And if the House Speaker is always trying to protect his members from taking controversial stands on issues that might lose them, it might just be 5 legislators in districts that have like a conservative bent, but the whole of the legislature is sort of held. The Massachusetts electorate is kind of undermined in things that they value because the House Speaker is taking this really cautious approach, and I'm not going to lose like one legislator.
And it seems like there's a cautious approach on the part of the Senate too. I'm trying to remember, was it the sports betting bill where they didn't do a roll call vote and we just learned they'd passed it? But what are your thoughts on this, Joan?
Well, I think it's the consequence of one-party rule. and also how Baker has played his role as governor. Where's the, all right, the people aren't outraged, but there's no real voice of outrage on the other side. Mm-hmm. He doesn't call out the legislature for doing what they did, deciding to take vacation rather than deal with the business of the day. He did take them to task on the issue of, we've got all this money, and that, by the way, there's a law that says we need to give some of it back. And he sort of picked that particular issue to sort of make the case. But they've gotten along quite well together. Mm-hmm. A legislature controlled by Democrats and a Republican governor have provided cover for each other. I don't know if that explains why people don't care, but I'm not sure why. I mean, I guess you have to connect the dots and tell them why they should. And the press does it to some extent, but the press has much less influence than it used to have.
And I guess if you imagine a counterfactual, if you imagine Baker, when the session wrapped up, going out and holding a press conference saying, here are all the things we wanted to get done that the legislature didn't get to, here are things they said they were going to do that they didn't get to, come on back in session, let's do this for the people of Massachusetts, it would feel very different.
That'd be page one.
Yeah.
Speaking in an old-fashioned way.
Yeah. Do you think that this represents a change from the way things used to work on Beacon Hill? I only came to Massachusetts in the mid to late 90s, only started paying attention to local politics in the 2000s. I have this vague inchoate sense that back in the day, you would occasionally get, for example, people looking to replace a sitting speaker with someone else. Or, I think back to Mitt Romney when he was governor and he had his reform team of Republican candidates that he was going to, allegedly use to clean out the State House, sweep out the mess on Beacon Hill. It didn't work out, but at least he dreamed of doing it. Has the passivity and acceptance of the status quo become more entrenched, do you think?
Slightly. I mean, I think it's always been this way, but in over the last 30 years, successive speakers have consolidated power and become speakers for life. I don't think that the change has been that dramatic. I do recall that 20 years ago we still had really low rate of legislators being challenged at the ballot box. So, and we've consistently had a Democratic supermajority. Yeah. Going back to my earlier point, the legislators could take bold stands. They could own their votes. The House Speaker could make things more transparent. Mm-hmm. And the Republican, we have 160 legislators, only 29 Republicans. In the last 10 years, we haven't had more than 34. Democrats could be real Democrats. They could take bold stands and not lose the supermajority.
We got to leave it there, unfortunately. I'll ask you, once we stop rolling, what your thoughts are on that. Joan Vennochi, Yawu Miller, thank you both.
Thank you.
And that's going to do it for tonight, but do come back next week. In the interim, tell us what you think. The email is talkingpolitics@wgbh.org. The website is gbhnews.org/talkingpolitics. And you can find me on Twitter. I'm @ReillyAdam. For now, thank you for watching, and good night.
On great performance.